Rain hammered the roof of the old gatehouse as Alina Hartley pushed the door shut behind her, gasping for breath. Her shoes were soaked, her cloak dripping onto the stone floor, and her ankle throbbed from a fall she had taken while running from the storm. She had not meant to trespass. She had only seen a light flicker through the trees and followed it, desperate for shelter from the freezing wind. The gatehouse looked forgotten, its shutters half broken, so she told herself no one would notice if she stayed until sunrise. She curled up near the cold hearth and let exhaustion pull her into sleep. She woke to the sound of boots striking stone and a voice sharp enough to cut through bone. A tall man stood over her, his coat still damp from riding, his eyes cold with suspicion. This was no forgotten building. It belonged to Marcus Ashwood, Duke of Ravensmore, and she had slept uninvited on his land. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why she had come. He turned to the servant beside him and spoke the words that would follow her for a long time to come. "Throw her out before breakfast." Alina rose despite the pain in her ankle, refusing to let him see her flinch. She had grown up with nothing, and she had learned long ago that fear only invited cruelty. She looked him in the eye and told him she had broken no law by seeking shelter from a storm that could have killed her. The Duke's steward, a quiet man named Harold Bennet, shifted uncomfortably beside his master, clearly unused to anyone speaking to the Duke this way. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight. 2 years ago he had learned what happened when he let a stranger close, when trust turned into humiliation in front of half the county. He was not about to repeat that mistake. He told her plainly that women did not wander onto his estate by accident, and that he had no patience left for schemes. Alina's temper flared despite her exhaustion. She told him she wanted nothing from him but the door, and that she would rather face the storm again than stay where she was so clearly unwelcome. She limped toward the entrance, gritting her teeth against the pain shooting up her leg. Harold stepped forward quickly, catching her arm before she could stumble on the wet stone steps outside. He glanced at his master, waiting for an order that did not come. Marcus stood frozen, watching the girl who had just defied him rather than beg. Something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like doubt. For the first time since his engagement had ended in disgrace, someone had looked at him without fear and without flattery. Then, on the slick path beyond the door, Alina's injured ankle finally buckled beneath her, and she went down hard against the stone, crying out before she could stop herself. Marcus was moving before he had decided to move at all, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his earlier order forgotten the instant her cry reached him. Marcus knelt beside her on the wet stone and saw at once that her ankle was swelling badly. She tried to push herself up and walk it off, but her leg gave out again the moment she put weight on it. He said nothing about his earlier order. Instead, he lifted her, ignoring her protests, and carried her back into the manor house while Harold hurried ahead to fetch the housekeeper. Alina was too proud to thank him and too much in pain to argue further, so she simply stayed silent in his arms, listening to the rain fade behind them as the heavy front doors closed. A physician was called from the village, and he confirmed what Marcus already suspected. The ankle was not broken, but it needed rest, and any attempt to travel for at least a week would only make the injury worse. Marcus stood in the doorway of the small room given to her in the servants' wing, arms crossed, clearly displeased with the situation he now found himself in. He told her she could stay until she was fit to walk, and not a day longer. Alina accepted the arrangement with a stiff nod, refusing to let him see how relieved she felt. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Alina kept to herself at first, mending linens and helping the kitchen staff to earn her keep, refusing to be treated as a charity case. The housekeeper, a warm woman named Charlotte Byon, quickly grew fond of her, impressed by how easily she spoke with everyone from the youngest scullery maid to the head cook, without a trace of the airs some guests put on. Word of the quiet, sharp-tongued young woman who had stood up to the Duke spread through the household within days, and more than a few servants found themselves rooting for her without quite knowing why. Marcus told himself he had no reason to seek her out, yet he found excuses all the same. He would pass through the kitchen corridor at the hour she usually sat mending by the window. He would ask Harold for updates on her recovery far more often than necessary. One evening, he found her in the library long after the household had gone to bed, reading a worn book she had found on a low shelf, her bad ankle propped on a cushion. He meant to tell her the library was not meant for staff. Instead, he asked what she was reading, and before he realized it, an hour had passed in conversation neither of them had planned. Alina noticed the change in him even as she refused to trust it completely. The cold, suspicious man who had ordered her thrown out spoke differently in these quiet hours, his guard slipping just enough to reveal someone weary rather than cruel. She still remembered his first words to her, and she was not foolish enough to forget them. Yet she found herself returning to the library the following night all the same, telling herself it was simply for the books. Neither of them noticed Harold watching from the corridor, a faint and knowing smile on his face as he closed the door quietly behind him. By the second week, Alina's ankle had healed enough for her to walk without a limp, yet she found herself in no hurry to leave. The library had become a nightly meeting place, and their conversations grew longer with each visit. Marcus spoke of his father, a demanding man who had drilled duty into him before he was old enough to understand the word, and of the dukedom he had inherited far too young. Alina listened without judgment, offering nothing but quiet attention, and slowly Marcus found himself saying things aloud that he had never spoken to anyone. One night, after a long silence, he told her about Isabel, the woman he had once planned to marry. She had accepted his proposal in front of half the county, then broken the engagement publicly 3 weeks before the wedding, claiming she had found a wealthier match in London. The humiliation had followed him for 2 years, shaping every guarded word and suspicious glance he had given since. Alina did not offer pity, which he was grateful for. Instead, she simply said that Isabel's choice said everything about her character and nothing at all about his worth, and something in Marcus's chest loosened at hearing it. In turn, Alina spoke of her mother, a seamstress who had raised her alone after her father's death left them with nothing but debts. She described years of mending clothes by candlelight, of going without food so her mother could eat, of learning to hold her head high even when shopkeepers looked at her patched dress with pity. Marcus listened closely, struck by how little bitterness lived in her voice despite everything she had endured. He began to understand that her sharp words on that first morning had come not from arrogance, but from a lifetime spent refusing to be pitied. Their friendship deepened in small, quiet ways. Marcus began walking with her through the gardens in the early evenings, matching his pace to hers without being asked. Alina started correcting his stiff formality with gentle teasing, and to the surprise of the entire household, the Duke of Ravensmore actually laughed, a sound none of the older staff could remember hearing in years. Charlotte Byron began to whisper to the other maids that something remarkable was happening, though no one dared say it aloud where Marcus might hear. Not everyone in the household welcomed the change. Marcus's cousin, Edmund Cole, arrived for an extended visit and immediately took notice of the girl who seemed to have won more of the Duke's attention than any lady of proper standing ever had. Edmund watched them together in the garden one evening, his expression unreadable, before retreating inside without a word. He had his own reasons for wanting Marcus to remain guarded and alone, reasons that had nothing to do with the Duke's happiness, and Alina's growing place in the household threatened every one of them. That night, as Alina readied herself for bed, she caught sight of Edmund watching her from the far end of the corridor, his gaze cold and calculating in a way that made her uneasy long after he had gone. 3 days later, a rumor spread through the manor like fire through dry grass. Someone was claiming that Alina had planned her arrival from the very beginning, that she had staged the storm and the fall on the path, and that she had set her sights on the Duke's fortune long before she ever reached the gatehouse. The story reached Marcus by way of a visiting neighbor who repeated it at breakfast as though it were common knowledge, watching the Duke's face carefully for a reaction. Marcus felt the old wound reopen instantly, memories of Isabel's betrayal rushing back with brutal force. For a moment, standing in the breakfast room with every eye on him, he let the doubt take hold, and his expression turned cold in a way Alina had not seen since their very first meeting. When she tried to speak with him privately that afternoon, he barely looked at her, his voice clipped and distant as he asked whether there was any truth to what people were saying. Alina felt something break inside her at the accusation. She reminded him sharply that she had nearly died in that storm, that her ankle had truly been injured, and that she had never once asked him for anything beyond shelter. She told him that if 2 years of hurt had taught him nothing except to suspect every kind word as a trick, then perhaps he deserved the loneliness he had built for himself. She turned and walked away before he could see the tears in her eyes, informing Charlotte Byron that evening that she intended to leave at first light. Alone that night, Marcus could not sleep. He kept returning to the rumor, turning it over until something about it began to feel wrong. He sought out Harold Bennett, who admitted, after some hesitation, that he had seen Edmund Cole speaking quietly with the very neighbor who had spread the story at breakfast. Marcus rode out that same night to confront the neighbor directly, and within an hour he had the truth. The story had been invented entirely, planted by Edmund, who feared losing his place as heir if Marcus married and had children of his own. Marcus returned to the manor consumed with anger, not at Alina, but at himself for doubting her so quickly. He thought of everything she had told him about her mother, about years of holding her head high through poverty and scorn, and he understood now how deeply his accusation must have cut her. He realized that his fear of being deceived again had nearly cost him the one person who had never once tried to deceive him at all. He found Charlotte in the hallway near midnight and asked, with unmistakable urgency in his voice, whether Alina had already gone. Charlotte told him that a coach had been arranged to take her to the village at first light, only hours away, and that Alina intended to leave Ashcombe for good and never look back. Marcus did not wait for morning. He rode through the darkness toward the village, his horse's hooves pounding against the muddy road as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the hills. He reached the small inn just as the coach was being loaded, its driver checking the harness while Alina stood nearby with a single worn bag at her feet, her face pale and resolute in the cold morning air. She saw him approach and turned away, telling him plainly that there was nothing left to say. Marcus dismounted and stepped in front of her before she could climb into the coach, his breath ragged from the ride, his usual composure entirely gone. He told her the truth about Edmund, about the lie that had been planted and the reasons behind it, and he admitted without excuse that his own fear had made him quick to believe the worst. Alina listened in silence, her arms crossed against the morning chill, unwilling to let his words undo the hurt so easily. Marcus pressed on, telling her that the rumor was never truly what frightened him. What frightened him was how completely she had changed him in only a few short weeks, how the manor that had felt like a prison for 2 years suddenly felt like a home the moment she began walking through its gardens and sitting in its library. He confessed that ordering her thrown out on that very first morning had been the worst mistake of his life, and that letting her leave now would be far worse. For a long moment, Alina said nothing at all, studying his face for any trace of the cold suspicion that had once defined him. She saw instead a man standing before her without armor, stripped of every guarded word he had once used to keep the world at a distance. Slowly, the tightness in her chest began to ease, and she asked him quietly what exactly he intended to do about it. Marcus dropped to one knee right there on the muddy road outside the village inn, ignoring the small crowd of onlookers gathering nearby. He told her he had no ring prepared and no elegant speech rehearsed. Only the plain truth that he wanted her beside him for the rest of his life, not as a guest, not as staff, but as his wife and equal in every sense of the word. He asked her to marry him, his voice steady despite the risk of rejection written plainly across his face. Alina felt tears rise as she looked down at him, remembering the cold stranger who had once ordered her out into a storm, and marveling at the distance he had traveled since that morning. She told him yes, her voice breaking on the single word, and he rose to pull her into his arms as the small crowd around them began to cheer. Back at Ashcombe, Charlotte Bryan and Harold Bennett stood waiting at the front steps when the two of them returned together on horseback, and the entire household soon learned that no eviction would take place that day. Instead, preparations began for a wedding, and the gatehouse where Alina had once sought shelter from the storm was later restored and named, fittingly, the place where everything between them had truly begun.